All right, welcome back, guys. We are going to look at lesson number 10 now. This is on Revelation chapters 12 through 13. And I would love to be able to go through this material quickly, but I have to finish this whole series by the end of May. And I go through this and I realize, man, I could make 4 weeks worth of lessons out of just these couple chapters because there's so much great content in this. So, well, I have some things to do and some places to be once school gets out. So it's not going to be very, if you give me some barbecue. Yeah, people on the video won't know why that's funny. Let's see. I'll tell you, I am kicking around an idea because we haven't had nearly enough time for interaction and discussion and question and answer in this series. My thought is to do one more lesson beyond the last Sunday, and it will be a lesson just of addressing questions that people want to ask. So I won't teach it live. It will only be on the YouTube. I will get your questions, collect them, and then try to group them together and answer the issues that keep popping up as the common themes throughout that. So be watching. If you just know exactly what you want to ask, feel free to post that question in the discussion thread on our message board for the class, or you can post it on a comment on the YouTube channel. You can post it, or you can email it to me or text it to me, whatever works. I'll just collect them in those kind of ways. And then that way, I'll try to address some questions and try to kind of fill in that gap where we haven't had nearly enough interaction going through. I've had some people that have reached out with some questions talking about theological systems and throwing around some big theological terms. I've had people both this week say, so you're amillennial, aren't you? And then other people say, so you're kind of a preterist, aren't you? And I'm not afraid of those words. I don't mind those words. But what I want to do first is I want to prioritize letting the text win. My undergrad degree is in New Testament. My graduate degree is in theology. And I like that I did them in that order, because I wanted to know how to take the text apart and put it back together, to figure out how the text takes me apart and puts me back together, before I started to try to connect the dots from lots of different texts and building a theology. And there is a give and take relationship between looking at the text and looking at big picture theology. But the danger is always going to big picture theology first before you look at the text. And there's a lot of people, especially with the book of Revelation, that they decide that their big picture theology looks like this, and so therefore we'll go to our text and try to make them fit. And you end up just trying to push a round peg into a square hole instead of letting the text win. Let the text say what the text wants to say. So I think that this approach, the approach that I've tried to model and the approach that I follow is one that lets the text do what it wants to do first. And then after the text does what it wants to do, what it really means, and that's what we talked about in the very beginning of this series, is the goal of every interpretation is to find the intended meaning of the author. It means what the author wanted it to mean. And we use different tools and techniques to try to discover what the author meant it to mean. This is not just true for Bible interpretation. This is true for every communication that you ever engage in. It's not true unless it's not accurate unless it's what the author intended it to mean. So we want to try to discern that, and I've tried to model that. What's challenging, obviously, is the different styles of genre of Revelation. And then on top of that challenge is all of the different various ways that other people have tried to interpret this. But even if this method of interpretation is new to you, it is not new to Christian history. This is a method that has been the dominant, really, honestly, this has been the dominant method of interpreting the book of Revelation throughout the majority of Christian history. It has really only been in the last 150 years that the current interpretation that is most popular has really become prominent, to the point that there are many people that don't know any other possible interpretation method than that. So I acknowledge that my interpretive method is not the only one here, but I want to let the text win as much as possible. And if you have questions to help me hold my feet to that fire, to help me ask questions that maybe I've ignored, you are welcome to ask those at any time. As we start with a bit of a recap, again, there's our recapitulation word. Last week, we focused primarily on Revelation chapter 7, which was a timeout. If we remember that there were, from 2 weeks ago, we were looking at the cycles of judgment. We saw the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets and the 7 bowls. And each series culminated in the final end where God poured out his wrath. And before each series ends, there was a timeout to focus on God's people that are holding on to Jesus, and Jesus is holding on to them. And that timeout in the first series of seals came in the form of Revelation chapter 7, where we saw that both the 144,000 and the great multitude are representative of God's people who are able to stand on the earth before the heavenly throne, who are able to stand on earth and able to stand before the heavenly throne because they are sealed by the blood of the Lamb, so that they can be a kingdom of priests that God's image bearers have always been called to be. What we didn't have a lot of time for last week, I just barely scratched the surface of chapters 10 and 11. And I'll say about as much now as I did about those last week. So if you were to summarize chapters 10 and 11, I think the big picture is this, that those chapters are focused on God's people while they accomplish the task of being the kingdom of priests on earth. That's our task. What does it look like to carry out that task? Well, that's a message that is sweet to hear. And in fact, when I finally unloaded that, there are some folks, some of you guys applauded when you heard that the dots finally connect, and that what it means that we've always been meant to be a kingdom of priests. And I will preach that, and you will applaud that, and you will be excited about that. And that message is sweet in your mouth, but it's bitter in your stomach. And that's what John experienced. He ate that scroll. That was that message that we're going to be a kingdom of priests. And then when it got down to his stomach, you realize it's not nearly as sweet as it sounded because of the experience of it. It means that God's people will suffer temporarily and in limited persecutions. They are saved by Jesus, so they follow Jesus. And those 2 witnesses, they act like Jesus by preaching and by suffering and by being shamed and by dying like Jesus died. But they are resurrected, and they are vindicated, and they are brought up to God's throne just like Jesus was. And in fact, all of that, I would just say, is when Jesus said, "Follow me," I think he had that in mind. I've heard some people that say, well, follow me, that just means, put God first in your life. And there's nothing wrong with putting God first in your life. That's a good thing. But following Jesus means that we have to know where he walked. And it means that we will walk behind him on the path that he walked. That sounds very sweet. It tastes very sweet, but that's a bitter message to digest. When you walk the path that Jesus walked, it is a path that does involve being a royal priest, which involves suffering on behalf of those who do not yet know the grace that they need. Thank God he did it for me. Because while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. And if we walk the path that he walked while this world is still sinners, the body of Christ just might die for them, just might lay down their lives for them. That's what it means to follow Jesus. We walk the path that he walked. So the last little note of recap is in Revelation chapter 11, verse 18. And this section is when we finish the timeout and we go back to the time in, and here is trumpet number 7. And this is the last ending of the very last of chapter 11, verse 18. It says, The time has come for judging the dead and rewarding your servants, the prophets, and your people who revere your name, both great and small, and for destroying those who destroy the earth. That little line right there is a hinge that shows a transition in the major structure of the entire book. Just that phrase. What does it mean for God to destroy those who destroy the earth? Who's destroying the earth? We're about to find out. So this is the teaser. We're going to find out who destroys the earth, and then we're going to find out how those who destroy the earth get destroyed. So the first half of the book is over. We've turned a corner into the second half of the book, and the rest of the book is structured topically in a giant chiasm. It's a structure, and the point is in the structure and the way that the material is arranged. So we'll look today at chapter 12, the dragon, and in chapter 13, where two beasts are introduced. If you keep going in chapter 14, Babylon the Great is introduced for the first time. And then in the middle of that, there are 7 bowls of wrath, another series of 7 that end in the final end of the world as we know it. But then after that middle point of the 7 bowls, the next scene is the destruction of Babylon. In chapter 17, Babylon is a woman, she's a harlot. But in chapter 18, she's a city called Babylon. And then the next section in chapter 19, there are 2 beasts, and those 2 beasts are destroyed. And then finally in chapter 20, the dragon is destroyed. And so you can see that they are introduced in this order, and they are destroyed in reverse order. And they are the answer to the question, who are the destroyers of the earth, and how will they be destroyed? That was the last statement that hinged at the end of the first half of the book. So second half of the book, here's the answer. Here's those who destroy the earth, and here are all the ways that they will be destroyed. And this little chiastic structure, this comes from lesson number 6. That was the lesson on the structure of the book of Revelation. One little just thing that I've noticed as I've gone through recording all of these, posting these to YouTube and seeing the views, I have noticed that is the least popular one to view. I was a little surprised. Honestly, it's one of my favorites. I feel like it's one of the lessons where the key kind of turns and everything begins to kind of click into place when we see that part. I don't know, maybe it wasn't just quite as interesting as some people had hoped, but that one I've noticed has fewer views than a lot of the other ones that come after it. But I would encourage you, if you haven't seen lesson 6, to go back and check that out. So let's read the text and then we'll walk through it today. Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2. A great sign in heaven appeared, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out as she was about to give birth. Happy Mother's Day. It just worked out. We've got a mama who is about to give birth. Let's start off with the fact that she's a great sign, not just a sign. There will be another sign, like the dragon will be a sign, but this is a mega sign, a great sign. And what is it that makes her a mega sign, a great sign? Well, because this sign is a sign that is multifaceted. Multifaceted. You can look at this sign from different angles and see that there are different fulfillments of this sign. This woman, she doesn't have a singular identity, a singular reference that she is signifying. So look at how she's described. She is clothed with the sun. Now, when was the last time we saw someone clothed with the sun? If you go back in chapter 1, verse 16, Jesus, we saw that vision of Jesus in chapter 1, and his face was shining like the sun in all its brilliance. And then in chapter 10, verse 1, the face of a mighty angel had a face like a sun. In my mind, this is what I think. she's pregnant. So that means the baby hasn't come out yet, but she's got a bit of a motherly glow as the baby who shines like the sun is inside of her and shining out of her. I see some kind of the beauty of that symbolism. But also the moon is under her feet. And I was talking before, in fact, tonight we'll do a lot of examples about how the symbols come from two major sources. We spent a whole week talking about how a lot of the symbols come from Old Testament background. And we will look at a lot of Old Testament background text tonight. But the other dictionary that the symbol vocabulary comes from is the Greco-Roman world, specifically really the Roman world and Roman culture. Let me tell you a story, a Roman myth. There once was a mortal human named Leto. She was beautiful, and the god Zeus was taken by her, and he impregnated her. And when it was found out that she was pregnant, there was a great dragon, a dragon named Python, who tried to kill her and her child. But the north wind blew and rescued her by blowing her to the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea. And there she was safe. And she gave birth not just to a son, but she gave birth to twins, Apollo and Artemis. And after 4 days after being born, Apollo set off to slay the dragon. 4 days. Does that story have some familiar themes to what we've just read? Some very familiar themes. Now, that's the Roman myth of their gods. But if you're a good politician, you know how to draw on the mythos of the culture and turn it to be about you. So Roman emperors would use that story to promote their own deification, that their emperor is a god. And the idea is that there is another goddess. Her name is Roma, the goddess of Rome, and she gave birth to a son, Caesar Augustus. And their Caesar is drawing on the Leto, Apollo, Zeus myth and appropriating it for himself to establish his political power. Not only did Caesar Augustus do this, but also the Emperor Nero. He liked to dress up like the god Apollo. And in fact, Emperor Nero minted coins with his face on the coin and radiant beams shining out of his face, which was the symbol of Apollo. And both Caesar and Nero, they brought peace. We call it a Pax Romana, which is a way of saying, I have slayed the dragon and brought the peace. This is Roman political propaganda based on a Roman god myth. And John takes the images from that and says, you want to know the real story? You want to know who the real woman is? You want to know who the real son is? You want to know who the real king is that brings real peace? Let me tell you another version of this story. That's what's going on. And that kind of material happens a lot in apocalyptic literature. Probably not something that a lot of us have heard a lot of sermons on, though. But that's the background to this text. Whew, that's deep. The woman, she's got 12 stars on her head. If she's got a crown, that symbolizes that she has authority. And if there's 12 stars, that number 12 we've talked about is a symbol of God's people. So there's authority, and she's connected to the people of God in some way, and she is pregnant. She's crying out in pain as she's about to give birth. This is not the nativity scene that we are used to seeing. This is not Silent Night, because all is not calm and all is not bright. Okay, and if I've been in the room when both of my children were born, and it is not a peaceful, serene scene as we think about this on Mother's Day. She is crying out in pain. Now think for just a moment. If I talk about a woman giving birth in pain, what other verse comes to your mind? Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. After the sin, after the fall, there is a curse. And that curse will have consequences for Adam and consequences for Eve, the woman. She will bear children in pain, and she will have offspring, and that offspring will crush the head of a serpent, even though the serpent strikes his heel. That's why she's in pain. God's people, a crown of 12 stars, that are the true woman who gives birth to the true king of the world, who conquers the true dragon. That goes back to another kind of story with another dragon, which is the reason why women give birth in pain. Ooh. The dots connect. That's the scene that's going on in all of us. So in our home at Christmas time, we have a big nativity scene on our mantle. And if you come to the Russell home, you will see a red dragon on the mantelpiece, along with the traditional nativity scene. I'm still waiting on a willow tree to make the red dragon, so it'll match the rest of them, but we had to buy a red dragon at Hobby Lobby. So it works. It works, but it's a reminder that there is more to the nativity scene than what we see. Plus, the red dragon is way more biblical than a stable, which the Bible never says, because Jesus was just born downstairs in the house. Okay. If that confuses you real quick, the Bible never says that there was no room in the inn. Sorry. The word for inn is a Greek word that is the exact same Greek word for where Jesus had the Last Supper. Where did Jesus have the Last Supper? In an upper room. Well, what it says is there was no room in the upper room. Exact same word. It doesn't say there was no room in the inn. It says there was no room upstairs. So Jesus was born downstairs. That's what it means. Okay. So the conclusion here, this woman, she in one way is a fulfillment of Mary, the mother of Jesus, the King of the universe. But we will see that because she is a great sign, she is more than just the single person of Mary. And what happens with Jesus is the true version of the myth of Leto and Apollo and Zeus, the son of God. We'll move on to the next part of the text. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth, and the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment that he was born. So another sign. This sign is not as great as the first sign. The first sign was a mega sign. This is just another sign. And this red dragon is going to be further defined in verse 9, if you read down below. And it will be defined as being renamed as the ancient serpent. Why is he an ancient serpent? It goes all the way back to Genesis 3. The ancient serpent is the reason why the woman gives birth in pain. Or the devil, or Satan. The dragon is renamed 3 times. And the dragon has enmity between it and the offspring of the woman. What happens to the offspring of the woman? The offspring of the woman in Genesis 3 is going to crush the head of the serpent. Her offspring will crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent will strike his heel. This red dragon has 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 crowns. 7, 10, 7. Those being symbolic numbers that we need to focus on the quality of those numbers more than the quantity of those numbers. And all of those numbers point to totality and completion. They are in contrast to the crown that the woman wears. She has a crown of 12 stars. He has horns and heads and crowns. She has real authority over God's people. He has authority over human nations and human powers on the earth. And later we'll see the boy being born. He has an iron scepter. He has true authority. The dragon has a false authority. And this image of the dragon seems to be some kind of composite from the beasts that appear, like from Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. There were fearsome creatures with 10 horns. One of them had 10 horns in Daniel 7:7. The dragon sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky. In contexts like these, the dragon, stars in the sky often refer to the heavenly host, which are an idea that stars are representative of spiritual beings, even perhaps angels, other Elohim. The English says swept the stars from the sky, but the Greek there says swept the stars out of heaven. And there is no different word in Greek between sky and heaven. It's the same word. We named a planet after that Greek word, Uranus. Uranos is the Greek word that both means sky and heaven. And they don't have a separate word, but if they want to differentiate, you saw Paul differentiate between this in 2 Corinthians, where he talked about how he knew a man who ascended to the third heaven. In 2 Corinthians, that reference there is referring to the first heaven. It's where the clouds are and the birds fly. It's the first heaven. The second heaven, where the sun, moon, and stars are. And then the third heaven, the realm of God beyond that. They would use that phrase as first, second, third heaven if they wanted to differentiate between them, but they can use heaven to mean any of the three, depending on the context. And this is likely, these stars likely do represent angels, because when we get to chapter 12, verse 9, we will see that angels will fall to the earth with the dragon. So these stars are probably representative of those angels. If you're paying attention, back in chapter 8, verse 12, that was in the trumpets, that was trumpet number 4, 1/3 of the stars fell. They were darkened. So if 1/3 of the stars were darkened in chapter 12, now we've got another third of the stars that are swept out of the sky. Does that mean that there's only 1/3 left? That's something I don't have the answer to that yet, but I found that really interesting, and it's something I'm going to keep my eyes open for as I continue to teach through the book this time. He wants to devour the child the moment that it's born, that he is born. So Satan doesn't want to give the child of the woman the chance to take away Satan's authority. So he tries to devour the child. He doesn't want his head to be crushed. And on earth, in the nativity scene, it looks like King Herod trying to kill the babies of Bethlehem in Matthew chapter 2. So right there, just to draw this out, why didn't John say, hey, remember that time when King Herod wanted to, kill the babies in Babylon or in Bethlehem so that he could kill baby Jesus? Why didn't he just say that? Because he's writing an apocalypse, because he's Jewish. That's the way it works. But just notice this. There is, it didn't look that like as John describes it, it looks so apocalyptic, so spectacular, so symbolic, and so scary. And it's the genre. It's the genre. He's telling the same story, but he's telling it in a new way. And so I've heard people say things like, well, when I see Revelation, I think it's going to look like something that we've never seen before, except we have seen it all before. Another example of this, when it talks about the sun darkening and the moon turning to blood and stars falling from the sky, like, well, obviously we've never seen anything like that, except 539 BC. That sun darkening and the moon turning to blood and stars falling from the sky, that's the kind of language that appears in Isaiah chapter 13. Isaiah chapter 13 is an oracle that describes the fall of Babylon. And it happened. It happened in 539 BC. So it's not something that we've never seen before. It's something that we've actually seen a lot of times. And if you keep reading past Isaiah 13 and read chapter 14, 15, 16, 17, you will see oracles against Edom and Assyria and Moab and other nations, and they have their falls too, and their stars fall and their suns turn black and their moons turn to blood too, and they have the same kind of apocalyptic language there that is just a symbolic of a judgment oracle. So that's a judgment oracle. It's just language that describes when a nation falls. So don't be surprised if when we're describing a nation falling that we use language like that. Yes, sir, Gary.
Isn't there somewhere that it says in the Bible that a third will enter heaven?
Maybe. I'm not sure. I need more context. I don't.
The stars, third stars, and the third is something else.
Is the other third of the stars in heaven? I can't think of a verse off the top of my head that says that, but if you find one, let me know. Sounds cool. Okay. Let's continue on with chapter 12, verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. So here's another one. We have a male child. It didn't say that he was a sign, but this is another sign. So who are we talking about now? Yes, this is obviously Jesus. And when it says that he will rule all the nations with an iron scepter, it doesn't just say rule. He will shepherd the nations. The word there is, your King James might, or your NASB translations might say shepherd the nations. That's the verb there, is the verb for shepherd, not just rule. He will shepherd the nations with an iron scepter. Maybe the guy who said, I am the good shepherd. It makes sense that he would shepherd the nations. Okay, so let's look at a parallel passage in Isaiah. Remember how the imagery draws from the Old Testament. Here's some Old Testament imagery. Isaiah is describing a woman going into labor. Before she goes into labor, she gives birth before the pains come upon her. Before the pains come upon her, she delivers a son. Who has ever heard of such things? Who has ever seen things like this? Can a country be born on a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? Wait, you see what just the parallel we made there? A baby is born, a nation is born. A baby can be born on one day. Who'd have thunk that a nation could be born on one day? That's what Isaiah is saying right there. Yet no sooner is Zion in labor than she gives birth to her children. Do I bring to the moment of birth and not give delivery, says the Lord? So do I close up the womb when I bring to delivery, says your God. Imagery from Isaiah. This is from that end of Isaiah, after talking about the suffering servant, and again prophesying the birth of God's people, the birth of the church. Another important parallel passage that will shed light on these verses of Revelation 12. From Psalm chapter 2, verse 9, this is the entire psalm. Why do the nations conspire against the peoples and plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up, and their rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed. You know what the word anointed is? What is it? Us. Anointed is Messiah. Yeah, anointed is Messiah. In Greek, Messiah translates to Christ. Against his anointed, saying, verse 3, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles, the one enthroned in heaven. Have we heard that phrase in Revelation a couple times? The one who sits on the throne? The one enthroned in heaven, he laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king in Zion, my holy mountain. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Now, that verse right there, God said to the Messiah, you are my son. Can you think of a couple times where God's voice spoke to Jesus and said, this is my son? What comes to your mind? The baptism of Jesus. This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased. Also the transfiguration. Also, John chapter 12, after Jesus does the triumphal entry, some Greeks want to see him, and the voice of God speaks, and Jesus says, the time has now come to glorify God. You are my son. And all three times that the voice of God speaks, in the baptism, the transfiguration, and after the triumphal entry in John 12, God's voice says, you're my son. Quoting this Psalm chapter 2, which says the Messiah is God's son. I have become your father today. Ask me and I will make the nations your inheritance. What's the inheritance of the Messiah? All the nations. It's like he, at the ends of the earth, your possession, you will break them with a rod of iron, like a iron scepter here in Revelation 12. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise. Be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord and fear and celebrate his rule with trembling. Kiss his son, or he will be angry with you, your way, and will lead you to your destruction. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. You want to be on the side of the Messiah. And if you're not, if you're a king that's not on the side of the Messiah, you're in trouble. And if you're a king that is not on the side of a Messiah, you just might look like a horn or a crown on a head of a dragon. Kings of the earth, all the kings of the earth, represented by those horns and heads, fulfilled here in this Psalm 2. And then finally, another parallel passage, a very familiar one when we talk about Jesus as Messiah, from Daniel 7. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, the phrase that Jesus loved to use about himself. Coming with the clouds of heaven, he approached. And if you go back and look, approached, her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Snatched up to God, here he approaches God, the Ancient of Days, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All the nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. He destroys the other ones, and by the end of the book, the dragon and all of his heads and all of his horns and all of his crowns are going to be destroyed by the one who has the iron scepter, the son of the one who has 12 crowns, a crown of 12 stars. All right, so that's the beauty of this passage. We're unpacking all of this, and all of these Old Testament passages, John is taking them like a beautiful artist and collaging them together for this image. Then we saw in the process here, you might have seen that 1,260 days. What do we do with that? Okay, here is apocalyptic symbolism on crack. Apocalyptic symbolism gone haywire. Okay, this is what it looks like, 1,260 days. Why 1,260 days? If you were to put that on your calendar, it would equal 3.5 years. 3.5 years. Now, that's not by our count, because we count 365 days. They counted 360 days. So it makes 3.5. But I want to just take this, and before I define this in the context of this passage, I want to point out how this symbol is recycled numerous times. Because in chapter 11, verse 2, back in the trumpets, there was a symbol of 42 months. What's 42 months? 3.5 years. In chapter 13, verse 5, again, a reference to 42 months, 3.5 years. Right here in this passage, 12:6, we see 1,260 days, but we saw that earlier in chapter 11, verse 3, 1,260 days. Earlier in chapter 11, verse 11, the two witnesses, they died and their bodies were left unburied for 3.5 days. And then when we get to chapter 12, verse 14, we will see time, times, and half a time. Did you count them? Time, times, half a time. Again, 3.5. All right, so 3.5, 3.5, 3.5, 3.5. Again, we don't need to quantify the numbers, we need to look at the quality, not the quantity. We need to weigh them, not count them. So why 3.5? Well, one reason why 3.5, Daniel 7 talks a lot about 3.5 and sevens and in some of his visions. So John is recycling some of the imagery that comes from Daniel. But 3.5 takes its symbolic value and what it is in relationship to that number 7. If 7 is complete, what's 3.5? Half of 7 incomplete. In every one of these contexts, this is John saying, there will be a time of suffering that you will face, but it's not a time of total suffering. It's not a time of complete suffering. It's a time of incomplete suffering. And just take a moment, think back, what has human history been like? There have been times and locations and occasions and generations that have had suffering, but it wasn't everything. It wasn't the end. It wasn't so much that you couldn't bear it. The fact that it's 3.5 means you can hold on. You can hold on 3.5 days. You can hold on 3.5 years. You can hold on 1,260 days. You can hold on for an isolated time, a time that is, we're not going to put this on our calendar and count off 1,260 days or 42 months or 3.5 years, but we're going to say that you will face occasions where there will be persecutions, and they're not going to be fun. I mean, look at the 2 witnesses. It wasn't fun what they went through, but they were able to hold on. So if it's bad and it's going to get worse, we better hold on tight, because he's going to win in the end. You can hold on tight because it will never be the total destruction. All the evil all the suffering that these evil forces can muster will only amount to just some discomfort that you can hold on and make it through. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, Paul talks about, in this world we have light and momentary affliction. John is saying the exact same idea that Paul says when he talks about light and momentary affliction. Yeah, so we face this. So how long have we been in the tribulation? Well, first of all, the tribulation had already begun during John's day. Remember, chapter 1, John was a partner in the suffering with the 7 churches. That word suffering is that word thlipsis, which sometimes is translated suffering and sometimes is translated as tribulation, and honestly should be translated consistently across the board. What John is experiencing is the same thing as what he's talking about now. But John is saying, I can hold on, you can hold on, and whoever faces any of this in the future, you can hold on. It's not going to be complete or total in all of these different kinds of images. That's, I think, what this image is about. So in verse 7, there's war that breaks out in heaven. Michael and his angels, they fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. And the great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. All right, now we get Michael. Who's Michael? Where did he come from? He is the only other archangel that is named in the Bible besides Gabriel. Gabriel has his name. Now, if you read the Catholic Apocrypha, there's a few other angels that are given names. Uriel and Raphael are other names, but those are in apocryphal books. But Michael is named in the book of Daniel, chapter 10, chapter 12, and he's referenced again in Jude. Michael is an angelic prince, a prince of the angels who defeats the powers that oppose Israel in Daniel chapter 10. Michael is the heavenly protector of God's people in Daniel chapter 12. And in Jude 9, Michael opposes the devil. However, Jude is referencing a book called The Assumption of Moses, which comes from the pseudepigrapha. And there are a lot more other details written about Michael in other pseudepigraphic works. But the big picture is that Michael fights on behalf of God's people. There is war in heaven, but we are not told anything about the nature of the war or the nature of the fighting. But the result is what we're told about. And the result is that he's hurled to the earth, and Satan had been able to enter the presence of God in heaven. And now he's hurled to the earth. He can no longer go into the presence of God. We saw in Job chapter 1, Job chapter 2, that Satan could enter God's presence, but now he cannot. Also back in Zechariah, Satan accused the high priest in Zechariah, but now he is hurled to the earth, and he can no longer do that. He can no longer be the accuser of the saints in heaven. And he's hurled to the earth along with his angels, that 1/3 of the stars that had been swept from the sky. Oh, there's the details on Michael, but that's just already in your notes. Then we have a victory song. I heard a loud voice in heaven say, ding dong, the witch is dead. Witch is dead. Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. Hold on to that word, authority and Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters who accuse them before God day and night has been hurled down. They, who are they? The brothers and sisters. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. He might attack you for 3.5 years, but you can win the fight. How? By the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. What happened to the two witnesses back in chapter 11? They looked like Jesus, they preached like Jesus, they acted like Jesus, they were persecuted, killed, shamed like Jesus, and as a result, they were resurrected and vindicated and ascended to heaven just like Jesus. Satan can try to kill God's people, but it has the opposite effect of what he wants. It's like Satan's best tool to attack God's people has been taken away and has actually been made ineffective. If you think about like a war, and like every gun that is shooting every bullet, and those bullets just turn into vitamins that make your enemy more healthy. Except not just more healthy, but that makes them like ultimately win every single time. Satan's biggest weapon to kill God's people has been taken away, and it works against him. Yes, Satan has been chained. He has been limited. His power is limited. Verse 12, therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them, but woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. So he had been an accuser. That was that Zechariah 3 passage where he was accusing the high priest in his filthy clothing, but God refused to listen to the accusation, and God gave him clean garments. In the same way, God's people are cleansed by the blood of the Lamb, and they are given white clothing to wear in Revelation 1 and 5 and 7. And so they triumph over the Lamb by the blood. They triumph over the dragon by the blood of the Lamb and the word of his testimony, and they didn't shrink from death. So Satan can try to kill us, but it works against his purposes. Killing Christians is just as ineffective as killing Christ. Hallelujah. And so we triumph. And so Satan is ticked. He is furious. He fights with all the strategies that he has left. And all the strategies that he has left, he can't kill us to separate us from God, so he can try to push us or pull us or trick us. And here comes those strategies. Verse 13. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings like a great eagle, so that she might fly to a place prepared for her in the wilderness, and where she would be taken care of for times and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. And then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river. From what? From his what? From his mouth, to overtake the woman and sweep her away from the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening up its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman, and he went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. So he's pursuing the woman. You can see clearly now that she is more than just Mary. She is the antitype of Eve. She is the fulfillment of Eve. She is the woman through which the Messiah is born, and she is also the people that are born out of her. She is the community of God. The community of God gave birth to the Messiah, and the community of God gave birth to the church. And all of those people who hold to God's commands and to the testimony about Jesus, that's the church. So do you remember when he heard a lion, but he saw a lamb, and he heard 144,000 of the tribes of Israel, but he saw a great multitude from every tribe, language, people, and nation. And here, there's a woman who looks like the old community that brought out the Messiah, but now the woman is the new community that brings out the church. Old covenant, new covenant, and all of these being merged together. So, that phrase, she was given wings, just like in Exodus, how God's people were carried off. See for yourselves, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you off on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. What actually happened? Well, there was this whole thing with plagues and a Red Sea that opened and closed and going out. And they ended up in a promised land. They ended up in a wilderness for 40 years. But that is poetically described as being carried off as eagle's wings. And we use that same imagery right here. Psalm 74. But God is my king from long ago. He brings salvation to the earth. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. Like a dragon that has many heads. It was you who crushed, Genesis 3, the heads of the Leviathan. Do you know what the word Leviathan in Hebrew, you know what it's translated to in the Greek version of the Old Testament? Dragon. The word Leviathan in Greek is dragon, and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. Where did the woman go in safety? To the desert. It was you who opened up the springs and the streams, who opened up the mouth of the earth so that it would swallow up the river from the mouth of the dragon. It was you who opened up the springs and the streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. John is meditating on Psalm 74 as he writes this. And then there's war against the rest of the offspring of the woman. Ezekiel 29, Ezekiel 32, and that might be Isaiah 32. I might have left off a reference there. And also Jeremiah 51. All three of those refer to the kings of those evil nations and refers to those kings as dragons. Kings of those evil nations are dragons. So now we go to the first beast. We've got 5 minutes to cover chapter 13, piece of cake. Here we go. And we'll do it this way. Your homework was to find ways that the evil imitates the good. And we'll see how you did on your homework. I'm going to skip past this passage and this passage to this, the same text, but I have highlighted now to show some of that imitation. Notice how the imitation is here. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea. Now, what was the sea back in heaven in chapter 4? It was a sea of glass. What will the sea be? And when we get to the New Jerusalem, there will no longer be any sea. But now the dragon stands at the shore of the sea. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns on its horns. It looks just like the dragon, doesn't it? And on each head it had a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet like a bear and a mouth like a lion. And the dragon gave the beast its power. That description is like a composite of the horrible beast that Daniel saw in his vision. And each of those beasts represented a different kingdom of the earth. So this first beast is drawing from that imagery, saying that Satan has a beastly tool to try to make war against God's people. The dragon gave the beast his power. Where did the power of the beast come from? It came from the dragon. And gave his throne and great authority. The beast has a throne of a dragon, an authority of the dragon. Where did the Lamb sit in chapter 5? On the throne of heaven. He shared the throne of the one who sat on the throne in heaven. This beast is an anti-lamb. He is an alternate lamb. He is a fake lamb, an imitation lamb. In fact, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but that fatal wound had been healed. How was the lamb described? The lamb who had been slain. Wasn't a fake slain, it was a real slain. But the beast, he faked it. He faked a resurrection. The whole world was filled with wonder, and they followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, and they asked, who is like the beast, and who can make war against it? You know who can make war against it? Maybe someone who has an iron scepter. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words. What did the lamb? The lamb uttered words that were words of praise and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. There it is, that 3.5 idea, the incomplete time of persecution. Verse 6, the beast opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. There's a 3 there, and talking back about blaspheming those that are on the throne back in chapter 4 and 5. Verse 7, the beast was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. Just sit in that. It's not comfortable, but it's there. To conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, language, and tribe, people, language, and nation. Remember who the great multitude came from? Every tribe, language, people, nation. Back in chapter 7. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, and all those whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. That goes back to one of the promises of the 7 churches, that your name will be written in the book of life. The Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world, he's the opposite. This beast is the opposite of everything that is true of the Lamb. Whoever has ears, let him hear. That comes from Isaiah, and Jesus loved to use that phrase. If anyone goes into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with a sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Remember the souls of the altar back in chapter 7 that cried out, how long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood? And the answer was, until more of you die. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. There was not an answer to that question other than there will be more who will die. It looks like we have to be like Jesus on this earth. Continuing on here to the next part where I highlight this. Verse 11. I saw a second beast. Did I skip anything? Where did I leave off? I left off in verse 10, so good. I'm picking back up here in verse 11. Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth, and it had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It looked like a lamb. But where does its voice come from? A dragon. It exercised all of the authority of the first beast. So we have this second beast. It comes out of the earth. The beast out of the sea, the beast out of the land. You remember that from Job? There was not only was there a Leviathan, who was a monster of the sea, there was a behemoth, the monster of the land. So we got these 2 sea monster and land monster images that are being used to create this scary image here. So we've got the dragon, we've got beast number 1, who is he's the imitation of everything that Jesus is. And this beast number 2 is going to be imitation of everything that God's people is. Look at the parallels between what number 2 beast, the beast of the land, he is everything that the 2 witnesses are not. It exercised the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. It performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven. Who was the last person that did great signs and caused fire to come down from heaven? In Revelation. In Revelation, that you're right, Elijah did that, but in Revelation, it was the 2 witnesses back in chapter 11. This second beast is the opposite of the 2 witnesses. Fire come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. What did those two witnesses try to do? They tried to bring the inhabitants of the earth to repentance. What community do you want to be a part of? Do you want to be a part of the community that suffers and acts like Jesus and calls this world to repentance? Or would you like to be a part of the community that is deceived and deceives others, deceives the inhabitants of the earth? It orders them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. Again, the fake resurrection because of the fake Jesus, the fake beast. So this second beast, it was given power to give breath. What happened to the 2 witnesses? They were breathed upon when they resurrected. Here, the second beast is given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak. Now we have an image, a puppet, that is speaking on behalf of the first beast, but it's the second beast who has his arm up the puppet, who is giving it the breath, so that the image could speak and cause all who refuse to worship the image to be killed. But what happens when you kill God's people? It backfires, because you don't take them further from God, you put them closer to God. It also forced all the peoples, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast and the number of its name. Okay, so to unpack this, we have the first 2, we have the unholy trinity. We have Satan, the dragon. We have a first beast out of the land that is an imitation of Christ. We have a second beast that was out of the sea. The second beast out of the land, who is an imitation of the 2 witnesses, which represent God's people. An unholy trinity here. As we have God, Jesus, and his people, we have here Satan, a false Christ, and a community of the false Christ, imitating everything that is good and holy, making a mockery of all that is good and holy. And so beast people, they get marked so that they can buy and sell, so that they can participate in the economy. But if you go back to chapter 7, the people of the Lamb, they were sealed. Why were they sealed? Because they had been purchased by the blood of the Lamb. Would you like to have a mark that can let you buy and sell, or would you like to be bought by the blood of the Lamb? That's the imagery and how the opposites are functioning here. So many of the deceptions, looking at this practically, what does it look like in actual application? Many of the deceptions that lead people away from Jesus are wrapped in the lie that it's good for the economy. How many times have you been fed, it's good for the economy? So you don't need to say anything against it. And you have just seen the second beast, which lives on both sides of partisan lines, which is fully alive and well in America and fully alive and well in other nations, and has been fully alive and well in every generation in between. There have been fake Jesuses, fake saviors, fake communities that preach to you, oh, it's good for the economy. That's why it's got to be good for you. Fake prophets. And so this is Satan's plan, if he can't kill you to separate you from Jesus, he will try to push you away from Jesus with persecution. He will try to pull you away from Jesus. And we will see that one next week as we look at the harlot and Babylon being pulled away with sexual immorality and materialism. And then the third one, he will trick you away from Jesus, which is that false prophet. So we saw here Satan's strategies. If he can't kill you to separate you from God, he will try to push you or here trick you. Next week, we'll talk more about seducing us, pulling us, like the harlot and the Babylon image. To end up on the mark of the beast, and you're going to be disappointed how little I talk about this. Okay, this calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. There was something called gematria. Gematria is where, and this has happened in many ancient languages where they didn't have Arabic numerals that stood for numbers. They would use their alphabet to stand for numbers. So it would be like A is 1, B is 2, C is 3. And as soon as you teach a kid to read, you teach the kid to add up the number of his name. It was just something that you would do. This happened not only in Hebrew, not only in Aramaic, but also in Greek and in Latin. This is used in all of those kind of contexts. Well, Romans actually had Roman numerals, but besides this, they would use that number. So if you add up the word, the numeric value of the letters in the word beast, just the word beast itself adds up to 666. That's it. So is it the number of, it says it's the number of a man? Well, if you add up the letters, the numeric value of the letters in the name Nero Caesar, it turns out to be 666. So it could be that. But again, this is just an image of not complete, not complete, not complete. Not 7, not 7, not 7. Fake, fake, fake. It's a trap, it's a trap, it's a trap. That's what it is. And it's on the right hand and it's on the forehead. It is the opposite of the Shema of Deuteronomy chapter 6, which is where we put God's word on our hand and on our forehead so that God's word filters everything that we do and everything that we think. But if you would like everything that you do and everything you think to be filtered instead of by God, let it be filtered by the systems of this world and the puppets of Satan. You got the mark of the beast. But the seal of the Lamb is 100% effective against the mark of the beast. And if you are washed in the blood of the Lamb, there is no concern for a mark of a beast. That's what that passage is about. So see you next week. Our homework is, I sent a link. I don't have the link on your handout. You can see it up here, or you can just search in YouTube, Bible Project. They have a video on Revelation chapters 1 through 11. They do a fantastic job on that video. Watch that and see how did that video help you understand how the different scenes of Revelation connect together. So thank you for your time, and I will let you go. I've gone over just a little bit here, but thanks for your time. All right.